Welcome to another episode of A Come Together. Shawn Levy, the original Shawn Levy, I think, right? I think are you older than the other Shawn Levy?
I am older.
Oh,
He had his credits in the public eye before I did.
right. There you go. But you're still older. You get credit for the name first, I think. You, sir, not to be confused with the other Shawn Levy, you are a prolific writer, and you do cover the history of Hollywood and a lot of Hollywood related topics, which is how I came across your work and came across you. I happen to love the entertainment industry and the history of the entertainment industry. I'm fascinated by it, and so when I threw into ChatGPT, hey, give me 10 guests that I could talk to that have written about this or the history or really whatever. You one of the people that came up. I did a quick Google and I saw the other Shawn Levy, and then I saw your website, and I was like, and then it says all over the site, I am not that Shawn Levy. I do not have anything to do with him, and I cannot help you. But, if you want to talk, feel free to reach out. So I thought that was great. So that was very funny.
Yeah, I literally just about every day of my life get emails directed to the other Shawn Levy, who is the executive producer and sometimes director of Stranger Things. He made Deadpool and Wolverine. He made The Night at the Museum. Like it's bad enough that we have the same name and the same middle initial, and he was born on my mom's birthday. But he also has his credits are not obscure.
Right.
And because they tilt toward younger viewers, his work, I tend to hear from kids. I have 2 emails this morning from kids wanting to be actors, one from Nazareth, Israel, and
Wow.
a kid from Minnesota who wants to direct movies because Shawn Levy made his favorite movie Cheaper by the Dozen 2. And I write back, sorry, I am not the filmmaker Shawn Levy, and I do not know how to contact him. And technically, I with my credentials as a
Sure.
journalist, I do know how to contact him. But I just want to get the kids off my back.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I have a folder in my Gmail with thousands, some creepy.
I can imagine, by the way. I can imagine you get a lot of the dark side of fandom too, right?
Yeah. Middle-aged man in France who wants a personal introduction to Millie Bobby Brown,
Wow, really?
Yeah. And I got a bunch of emails once from someone imprisoned in Texas, and he was making threats against me, Shawn
Yeah.
Levy. And I was like, what? I used my research skills, and I found out that there was another Shawn Levy, same spelling, living in Texas
Oh,
with a
man.
landscaping business. And I
Yeah.
think he was involved with this convict's partner. And
And
thankfully those stopped.
you're just a dude in Portland, Oregon, trying to mind your own business.
Yeah.
It's so funny. So funny. Yeah. Yeah, it comes with having one of the most two very, very common names.
You
That I don't get many of those emails. I don't have a hard time with Ephraim Hirschman,
Yeah. I was born in 1961, which is the year before Dr. No comes out. So in America, Sean Connery, Sean, was not a well-known actor, and most
Hmm.
Americans would not have known how to pronounce that name. Irish
Hmm.
Americans would have
Sure.
known it. And my parents liked the name and decided to spell it phonetically, Shawn.
Hmm.
And most Seans since the 60s spell their names Sean. But this
Yeah.
guy, this filmmaker born in Montreal a few years after me, his parents made the same choice. It's kind of crazy.
That's very funny. It's very funny. Well, tell me a little bit about how you got into journalism and writing, and specifically about Hollywood, because I mean, correct me if I'm wrong. It looks like a lot of the characters and the people that you write about aren't just they're not just famous for being actors, they have extra stories to them, and they have other sides to them, like the Rat Pack or like Robert De Niro, or like there's a certain persona that comes with the actor, with the individuals as well. How'd you get started in all this?
Um, well, I was always a writer. I was a
Okay.
writer from the time I was in elementary school.
Hmm.
And I also was always a movie buff. My dad was a big movie buff. He was not a scholar of movies, but I'd come home from school and there'd be a note saying, "Oh, On the Waterfront is on TV tonight at 11. So if you take a nap and do your homework, you can watch it with me." This kind of thing. And
That's great.
this is in the days before VCRs, before cable. So if you would get the TV guide at the beginning of the week and you'd look and see what movies are on. And,
I still remember
in those
that.
days, you would read about a movie or hear about a movie, and it might be years before you could see it.
Yeah.
And this is in New York City, this is not like, in a rural community. So I always had that and went to college in Pennsylvania, veered more into my writing lane, and then took an MFA in poetry at UC Irvine. Um, and by the time I finished that degree, I was married and had a child, and I needed a career.
Yes.
Um, poet poet was my passion, but clearly a tough dollar. Um, and this is how long ago this was, even though it's, vivid memory for me. It's the mid '80s. Every
Mhm.
day the LA Times would show up on the front step, and I would look in the want ads for writer and editor. And
Wow.
in 1988, 87, I can't recall, I got a job at a film magazine. I had been doing sort of freelance reviews for a freebie newspaper in Orange County, California. I didn't even get paid. I got coupons that were good at restaurants. So my
There you
wife
go.
we'd save those coupons until we had like enough for a splurge, and we'd go out and have a slap up meal. But I got that
Great.
job at Box Office Magazine, which is still publishing. It's the oldest continuously published film only publication in the United States. It started in the silent era. And based on working there for about 16, 18 months, I got a job at American Film Magazine, which was quite prestigious. It was the monthly magazine of the American Film Institute. And when that magazine folded, my then wife, who was a native Oregonian, and I found ourselves, she had finished her PhD, and we moved to Oregon with our two children by that point. And I started writing reviews for the daily newspaper in Portland, the Oregonian. And I started my first book with an agent in New York, placed a biography of Jerry Lewis with St. Martin's Press. And that's more than 30 years ago. And I was at the Oregonian from 92 to 2013 and continued on as a film critic on the NBC affiliate here in Portland
Mhm.
until 2016. But all that time I was writing books. The first book was published in 96 and my most recent was this year.
Wow.
So
Awesome.
it
Awesome.
was a passion and a skill, and I was really, really fortunate. A
That
number of
sounds
lucky breaks
like the
along the
dream.
way.
It sounds like the dream,
Yeah.
it really does, I mean, I had my own, I was also a creative writing and literature major in college. I love the poetry got me hooked on that. I took my first class was, creative writing. It was an advanced class with a phenomenal poet, blue collar poet named Joe Weil, and the first thing he sits us around like, our class is 12 people in a conference room, and, we're sitting around a big table, a circle table, and he goes, "In order to be a great writer," he goes, "you have to love at least 50 things more than writing." He's like, "The best writers are the people that are passionate about life, that love things." He's like, "'Cause otherwise you have nothing to write about." And I never ever thought of that. I never ever thought, like, I always would write for the sake of writing. Okay, it's time to work my writing. It's time to practice my writing. And he's like, don't look at it like a chore, look at it like an opportunity to express your love and passion for something. And that like ignited me. And then similar to you, I graduated and realized I had to make I had to make a living, and all of a sudden, create, especially in, 2017, creative writing was not on the top of most people's checklists for what they want out of a college graduate. So
Right.
I always found ways to implement writing into my life, and eventually, I wrote poetry, and I'd write, short essays, and but this podcast is really my first kind of stab at turning, some kind of form of communication, whether it's freestyle or or a little bit more formal, into something, that's full time, but um it feels daunting. It feels daunting to say, like, when you don't, especially because the path for a writer is so not linear and so not clear and so unique for each person. You talk to 10 writers that have made a career out of it. They have 10 different paths. How did you how'd you pick to start a biography? How'd you get like how do you go about researching your first book if you never did it before? How'd you even get an agent? What'd you do about this kind of stuff?
Oh man. I was again, this is a different media landscape than today. In Portland, I'm very blessed to be part of a writing community of very creative people who are, you know, 40 and older, who are writers, but they have careers, uh, carpentry, um, baking, teacher, a number of things, but in their hearts, they are writers, and that's their passion. And I look at their paths, and I feel so lucky that I was doing something that kind of made sense in a businessman's mind, a publisher's mind, an
Sure.
agent's mind, and I was doing it in the '90s when the playing field was a little more, open and accessible to a newbie.
Right.
Um, I because I was at American Film Magazine, I was in touch with a lot of serious authors who would occasionally write for this magazine, in part because they loved the magazine, or we would give them an opportunity. Spend a
Would you
week
reach
with
out to them to begin with, or they'd reach out to the magazine and say, "Hey, you wanna contribute?" And you'd respond and be like, "Oh, that's cool. I'd love to be in touch with you."
we reached out to them. Sometimes we knew they were subscribers
Sure.
because, the deal was if you belonged to the American Film Institute, you got a monthly subscription to our magazine. And if you wanted to buy the magazine, that came with a membership to the AFI. So as a
Mhm.
result, our readership was like, in those days, Charlton Heston, Gregory Peck, Spike Lee, Steven Spielberg. We'd occasionally get
So cool.
letters. And authors knew that.
Yeah.
So I was able to call Pulitzer winning, best-selling authors and say, we have a strange opportunity to offer you if you're interested. And, it would be like spend a week on the set of The Godfather 3, or
Yeah.
go to Japan and watch Wim Wenders edit a movie digitally. Never been
Mhm.
done before. And
Right.
we would pay for the trip,
Yeah.
so when the magazine folded, I reached out to the ones that I had, sort of a personal relationship with, and said, I want to get writing books. Do you think your agent would be interested in taking my pitch?
Mhm.
And a couple of people recommended their agents, and I was going back and forth to New York at that time to visit family, and I met with these agents, and two of them said yes. And then I
Show them
chose.
pieces of your work in order to get them to sign your agent? You'd be like, "Oh, here's my resume. Here's what I've written before. What do you think?"
Yeah, my background, a couple of articles, and then I had a proposal of a few pages to write a book about Pedro Almodovar, the Spanish director whom I love and whose set I visited. I threw myself a plum assignment at American Film and went to Madrid and watched him shoot a film and spent time with him and his cast and his family.
So cool. So
So I
cool.
thought I thought a book about him would be good, and um, the agent I chose shopped the thing around, and there was a publisher who said, well, we like this guy's writing a lot, but we're not interested in this subject. What we're interested in is a book on Spencer Tracy. And, I didn't have anything to say about Spencer Tracy. And this gets back to something else you asked about how do you choose a subject?
Yeah.
Um, to me, Spencer Tracy is sort of linear and it's all about acting. He has a private life and maybe the private life, alcoholism and his, longtime affair with Katharine Hepburn and, rumors about his being bisexual. But that's not enough for a book. It's an
Okay.
article, it seems to me.
Yeah.
For a book, you need variety. And also, like, it had to spark me. And
Sure.
I told this agent, "I'm not interested in Spencer Tracy, but before you say no, let me see if there are other subjects I could counter with." And I came up with a list of 4 or 5 people, um, one of which I wound up writing about almost 20 years later, Paul Newman,
Cool.
but he had just been written about, and you can't flood the bookshelf.
Right.
I knew that even then, and a little bird popped into my head and said, "Jerry Lewis." And right away, I knew about Jerry Lewis. It's like, oh, physical comedy, directing his own movies, the muscular
Mhm.
dystrophy telethon, the partnership with Dean Martin, the business about the French thinking he's a genius. So already there's a lot more stuff than you can say
Yeah.
about Spencer Tracy. So I countered with that, and that publisher said no, thank you. But the next publisher she went to with the proposal said yes.
Got it.
And so that was the start, and she got me next to no money, like $15,000, which is a huge sum, actually, for a first book from an unknown author. But I was trying to support a family. So in
Sure.
my brain, I fired her. And one of the agents who I had met with during that initial search was we really vibed, but he wasn't interested in Pedro Almodovar. And I went to him and I said, "I have this offer for a book on Jerry Lewis. Here's the proposal. It's 1992. I'm faxing the proposal." And he called me back and he said, "I think this is a really good proposal. And I think you're right that $15,000 is not a good offer. But
Wow.
my father and I, his father started the business. My father and I have known your agent forever, and we're not going to steal a client from her." And I was like, wow, I actually really admired this. This was a no, but it was like, if you want to formally withdraw the proposal from her and formally propose it to us, you can do that. And at the time, I was collecting unemployment. We were living in an apartment in a suburb of Portland, trying to get a foot in Portland. My dad was literally on his deathbed, and I had a conversation with him, and he said, "Wait a minute, someone offered you $15,000 to write a book, and you're going to tell them no?" He says, "Here's what you do. You take that $15,000, you write the book, and years from now, you tell people, guess what they paid me for my first book? Go on, guess." Exactly right. It's exactly what happened. I took the deal, wrote the book, let the agent go. And when I visited New York subsequently, I started visiting this other agent who had said, "My father and I can't do this." And he's been my agent now for 30 years.
Wow. Wow. Awesome. Awesome. That's a great story. And it's great that he was able to balance, like, he's able to tell you, excuse me, something enough to make you to, like, for you to have something to do with, something like he gave you something to work with and maintain loyalty at the same time. It's really cool. You know? That's really, really so what do you do? How do you go about researching and interviews? And how many, like, what are the hours and the days and the how long does it take to write this? Like, because
Well,
$15,000 sounds great unless it's for a year and a half, and then
yeah,
it's like, well,
yeah.
that's not great, you
And
know?
it was about, got the deal in early 93, and the book was submitted more than 2 years after that, like April of 95.
Wow.
Um, a lot of the research goes into, is there a book in this subject? So, for instance, I wanted to write about Paul Newman. It He was the subject of my 5th book, and I saw that there were lousy books written about Newman, and they were all a certain age old. So from those books, I could get the basic chronology, the basic backstory, but then you have to find something, some archive, some a fountain of information that you can
Yeah.
sort of use as the spine of the book. For Jerry Lewis, pardon me, when I was doing my research, I discovered that he had donated the papers of his film company to USC. So I could go to USC every day and
Yeah.
look at box after box, scripts, correspondence, memos,
Wow.
box office reports, budgets. Like I took so many notes. Then I discovered two archives that I use on every single book. One in New York, the New York Public Library branch at Lincoln Center. It's right there in Lincoln Center.
Yeah,
Has
I'm familiar with it.
the Billy Rose Library has a clipping collection on
I
every
think Bob
entertainment
used to write there.
pardon?
I think Bob Dylan used to write there, or go to read, news stories and read about obscure people and then write songs about them.
It's yeah, it's very possible. But you could go in there and say, "I'm interested in Jerry Lewis," and they would bring you out an accordion file with
Wow.
clippings, like physical clippings going back to, in Jerry Lewis's case, the 40s.
Wow.
And so for Jerry, I had these clippings that covered his entire career.
So that's
This
a
is
ton of work already done for you.
say again, please?
That's an enormous amount of work already done for you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you have to gather it and you have to make sense of it and you have to find a way to tell it.
Yeah.
Um, and really, I learned how to write a book by writing that book.
Right.
But then you start just reaching out to people. And again, this is like pre-internet, 1992. There's like, there's little internet things, but there's no World
The
Wide
Yellow
Web.
Pages.
There's no
Sure.
internet movie database. Um, no libraries are online. To find that there was no book on Jerry Lewis, I had to use a modem, the old
Mhm.
and tap into the UC Irvine card catalog,
Uh-huh.
which my ex-wife and I still had access to because, we were still using passwords that hadn't been removed from the system.
Mhm.
And through that, I got to the UCLA card catalog. They're shit, they're basically one large university with 10 campuses. Um, and that I could see, oh, this doesn't exist. Today I can go to Amazon, which didn't exist then,
Sure.
and just find previous books on the subject. Um, so like you would physically write a letter to anyone you thought could, to the agent, which you could find. There used to be a service, the Screen Actors Guild. You would dial this number and it was basically it was there for you to make offers of work to actors.
Cool.
And I knew about this from my journalism work. So I'd say, I'm looking for the representatives of Bette Midler, Phyllis Diller, and Billy Crystal. I'm just, pulling names
Sure.
out of the air. And they would say, oh, they're represented by so and so. And then you would call that office and, pitch that you want to do an interview. And then when you're done interviewing, you say, who else do you recommend I talk to? Can you give me contact information? Journalism stuff.
This is exactly how my podcast works. I mean, as far as finding guests and doing the same thing, I mean, I go to Google, I say I want to talk to people about, again, a history of Hollywood, and then I find you and I talk to you and I say, oh, hey, by the end, at the end of the conversation, is there anyone else that you recommend I talk to based on our conversation that you think I'd enjoy talking to? Pass it along, and the ball just gets rolling, and it all snowballs. So I totally see how that happens in any kind of journalistic sense, right?
Yeah, and people are always wary when you're writing about a living person. Do you have their permission? Um, and I actually sent a letter to Jerry Lewis, and he called the house landline. I had call
Wow.
waiting, and got the sound that I was talking to someone, an editor, about an article I was trying to get published, and Jerry invited me to meet him, and he owned a yacht that he kept docked in San Diego. His primary residence was Vegas.
Cool.
And I went to San Diego and spent 3 hours in the cabin of this boat talking to Jerry Lewis. Um,
What was
and
that like? Was that
it was kind of crazy.
it's crazy, right?
Yeah, I knew a lot about him at that point. And I wanted him to know that I knew a lot about him so that I didn't get like, you know, big sweeping content free answers to my questions. So the
Sure.
first questions I asked were really specific, like strange things. He had a first cousin who was coming home from work as a young woman and was murdered on her way
Wow.
home. I asked about his cousin Judy, and he's like, You know that story?" And and then again he said another thing that I asked him about. He's like, You know about that?" And I was like, "Dude, I am literally writing the book." It's like, um, so we had this conversation. Then he said, anyone you need to contact, tell me, I'll tell them to call. And people from his past, coworkers, friends, etc.,
Wow, amazing.
were reaching out. Then we had a second meeting. And from the time I arrived at the boat basin in San Diego, it was a completely different atmosphere. He was hostile. He was abrupt.
Really?
Um, he, I don't know what it was. I might, years later, I think maybe something I said, he was very thin skinned, narcissistic, always right, always the best. When the current president first revealed himself as a candidate for office, I was like, this is this is Jerry Lewis I'm looking at. This is the
Really?
same personality type. Um, Never wrong, slaps his name on everything. Yeah, so I
That's
must have said
fascinating.
something that irked him.
And they're both
And
huge entertainers.
yeah, they're mass appeal guys. And Jerry, when his film and comedy career sort of plummeted, the audiences didn't want to buy tickets. Network TV didn't want him on anymore. He devised this job for himself where he sat at a telethon desk every Labor Day weekend in a tuxedo and accepted checks from people. Like, that was a weird job. And again, we're seeing that in the Oval
Yeah,
Office.
yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah. It's
but
very funny.
during this conversation, I then brought up a subject that I knew was slightly touchy.
Sure.
In 1972, Jerry went to Sweden and made a movie called The Day the Clown Cried about a clown who's imprisoned at Auschwitz and who entertains the Jewish children and leads them into the gas chamber. Like
Oh,
they're
shit.
like, and this is Jerry Lewis, the most infantile, like Jim Carrey type of comedy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he had never appeared in a drama of any kind. One or two episodes of TV shows
Sure.
that were completely forgotten. And he mortgaged his home. His producer screwed him. The Swedish studio held on to the movie. The movie has never been seen in its entirety. There is
Wow.
allegedly a copy in Stockholm in a private collection because the studio eventually went bankrupt and everything they owned was incinerated. But some guy knew that this was in
Why?
there.
It's gotta be there's gotta be value there. I mean, even if you
Yeah,
auction off the stories to anyone, I mean,
yeah,
like,
yeah.
stories get sold all the time, or stories get sold all the time.
At any rate, this thing has yet to be seen, probably never will be seen. If it is seen, it'll be seen in some sort of scholarly version where some
Yeah.
narrator will have to say, "Now
Wow.
now should be a scene about this." Anyway, I asked him about it.
Can you bring is there a way to bring attention to,
Oh,
like,
it's
that
it's
movie and see to
it's
see if anyone can get a hold of it?
yeah, it's widely known, and there is a fellow working on a book about it.
Oh, yeah?
Um, uh, and he and I have been in touch, and he has actually been to the fellow's home who rescued the one dubbed copy and
Wow,
seen the
wow.
entire film. And everything I've seen about it, it's exactly what you would think. It's Jerry Lewis directing and acting in a movie about a clown in Auschwitz. It's
Wow.
insane. It's well beyond his skill set. And just the whole thing. the taste, this is
Someone's
20.
gotta tell, like, David Zaslav just, like, to get his hands on it or something like that, you
Right.
know?
Oh,
Like,
it's a legend in Hollywood.
spend
Like,
this money on everything anyway, just buy that stupid script, you know? Buy the
I
movie.
think right now somebody does own the rights to it, to the original script. This was one of the problems, that the producer who brought Jerry on did not own the script. He had let
Oh,
his option
man.
expire, so the day Jerry Lewis began shooting, he was basically stealing the material, and he didn't know, allegedly.
What shame. Wow. So
Yeah.
you brought it up to him.
I brought it up, and he went crazy. "What the fuck do you think? What the fuck do you think?" And red-faced, he had been drinking beer, it was not even noon, and yelling in my face, and I have never been in the Marines, I never played gridiron football, I've never been greeted like this by, an older person, much less somebody I grew up watching on television.
Yeah.
And, he went through 3 or 4 salvos of ripping me apart, and then he grabbed my tape recorder, again, 1993, so we're talking about a physical cassette recorder,
Yeah,
and he
yeah.
said, "I'm not letting you have that." And I said, "That has hours of my work on it." Like the previous
Yeah.
conversation said, "Well, I'm gonna erase this part of me yelling at you and send you the tape," which he did. The tape ended with him, "What do you think? What do you think? You know?" And then silence.
That's it.
But I went out to my car, right? It was clear that I had to leave. I went out to my car and I wrote down everything that I could remember that I had just heard come out of his mouth. And at the end of the biography, which was also weird, in the following months, I was still speaking to people who Jerry was close to with his approval. So even though he washed his hands of me in such a brusque way, he was still letting people talk to me.
Yeah. I bet you're trying to but I bet that you're counting on the fact that people are gonna your friends are gonna do damage control, you know, and
Yeah,
that they're
yeah.
gonna put in the good word and whatever it is.
But the very next day, I had lunch with an editor of Movie Line magazine, another former publication, and this guy grew up in Hollywood. His dad was a producer, uh, and he said, "Yeah, everyone knows Jerry Lewis has 3 sets of teeth, and now you've seen it, so that when you write about him and you hear terrible things, you're gonna know, yeah, there's a chance this is true." And that's something that you learn as a biographer. You get so steeped in someone that, there was I just finished Clint Eastwood, and that was 2 plus years of, like, being deep into his work and every interview he ever gave, and,
Yeah.
conversations with people who know him and work with him. And an article came out, about a year ago, quoting Clint Eastwood, and I was like, my editor, in New York, sent me the link, and I said, "That's not Clint Eastwood.
Yeah.
Clint Eastwood has never said that sentence." I
Yeah.
just knew it, you know,
Yeah.
just the way
Yeah.
you would know, like, if someone tried to mimic your sibling
Yeah. Sure.
in a spoof email, they would never use that word, or they would never make that grammar mistake, or whatever the tell would be. And that's something, like, when I'd hear stories of Jerry, like, exploding on someone, I was like,
Checks out.
matches the guy I met." Um,
Right, right, right. Do you feel, after all your experiences, do you feel, the expression "never meet your heroes," stands true? Or, like, be careful about meeting your heroes?
yeah, yeah, he was never a hero of mine, so I did have that distance from him. And I feel like, in a certain sense, like, people still read that book and talk to me about it all the time. The last chapter of the book, I told the story that I just told you, of my
Yeah.
time with Jerry. And years later, I'm working at the Oregonian. I meet Tom Hanks. He's promoting a movie. We have an interview one on one like this in person. And um,
What was
I
he like?
Oh,
Was he
he's
nice?
exactly who you think he is.
Oh,
I've met
yeah?
him a half a dozen times, including at a soccer match here in Portland, and we've just had the greatest chats. He's
Wow.
interested in you, and, appreciative, and, um, there was a period of time where I was interviewing him fairly regularly, and every time it seemed I had just released a book, and I would bring him the books because, of course, you give your book to
Yeah.
Tom Hanks. So I gave him the Jerry Lewis book. He says, "Oh, I've read this." And then he says to me, he was out to dinner with Martin Short, Paul Reiser, and another comedian whose name I cannot never remember. And he said Marty Short spent the entire dinner doing imitations of Jerry throwing me off the boat. And I was like, "You're kidding." And then a few years later, I'm at Sundance, I'm in the lobby of the big theater, and there's Harry Shearer, the Spinal Tap comedian, and, um, I interviewed him for the book because he's one of the few people on earth who Jerry showed The Day the Clown Cried to. When Harry
Okay.
was a young comedian, his buddy was one of the producers of the telethon. And Jerry thought, "Oh, here are these two young hip guys. They'll appreciate what I'm doing." So I
Sure.
was like, what was it like? And Harry's famous quote is, "It was like a black velvet painting of Auschwitz." It was like
Wow.
the tackiest rendering you can imagine. But I went up to Harry and introduced myself. He goes, "Oh, you're the guy." And then he taps a woman on the shoulder. He says, "Honey, this is the guy Jerry Lewis threw off the boat."
No way.
So that'll be in my obit. You know,
You know what? That's not bad, man. That's
it's
not
it's
that's not bad.
it's a good story. But it was also so telling of the man. Like
Yeah.
by capping the biography with that, I was like, this is who he is today. Because the book was published in '96 and he passed in 2017.
I'd be fascinated to know on, like, his end, if he was if he was lashing out because he was disappointed it never got made and he didn't wanna talk about it, or he was embarrassed, or, I wonder what play like, 'cause, like, anger comes from all kinds of different places, you know? I wonder what was driving, like, that emotional outburst, because
I think a
I mean,
couple of things
if
were
I was
happening.
disappointed or something like that, I wouldn't get angry or take it out on a dude that that's writing the book of my life. I would, I mean, I don't think, and I mean, I just unless you feel like it's just that you had a loss of control and you want to control that kind of narrative and you don't want to even bring it up or talk about it. I don't know.
I think he got the feeling that I was pitching toward a negative version of his life, which,
Gotcha.
most people who know showbiz and showbiz history, when you mention Jerry Lewis, they're like, how can you write a positive? Um,
Right.
but in fact, when the book came out and was reviewed in the New York Times, Time Magazine, Washington Post, like all the places that
Sure.
were,
Amazing.
big legacy media, they all said, it's warts and all, but what's interesting is he makes the case that this is a neglected major performer and creator.
Right.
And the best review was in Screw Magazine, which was sort of like a edged toward porn, but didn't have photos, but like
Uh-huh.
covered the porn
Sure.
industry. I had no idea they wrote book reviews, and I get this clipping from the publisher, and Screw Magazine called it a remarkably fair portrait of a great American asshole. And I was
Wow.
like, "Oh,
Beautiful.
please put that on the paperback."
That should be on a tombstone. That shouldn't be
Yeah,
that should be on a tombstone. Oh my goodness, remarkable
and
portrait, wow, of a American
the
asshole.
people who unabashedly love Jerry Lewis to this day,
Yeah,
you know, always I figure, "Oh, they must hate me," but when I encounter them or they reach out to me, it's always like, "You did such amazing work, and I didn't know this. I really appreciate him more. I'm glad I didn't know him." Like, that often comes up, but that
sure.
doesn't change my feeling about his work and the public
Yeah,
story,
yeah, yeah. How
and
do you feel about that?
that's the
About
truth.
separating the art from the artist?
You know, Clint is a good example of this. Clint Eastwood, he and I don't agree politically, and we speak about him in the present tense. He's 95 and he released a movie last year that he directed and produced.
Yes.
A good movie.
But they were
Juror
supposed to have 2 parts, right?
No, it's called Juror Number Two because
Okay, so
it's
I'm thinking of
a
something else.
courtroom
Okay.
drama.
Okay.
Um, and you know, after with Jerry, it was very hard because, like as I say, I had never been treated like this to my face by anyone. And yet I had to wake up every day and sort of be as journalistic and fair as I could be. And then I had to watch all the movies that Jerry made. And between 1949 and 1969, he probably made 25 movies.
Right.
Nobody's got 25 good movies in them in 20 years, much less someone who's their own producer, writer, director, star,
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
and who's trying to pitch a kind of comedy that was hilarious for a brief window in the
Mhm.
50s and palatable because he was standing next to Dean Martin, who's everybody's best friend. And then on his own was trying to push this during the era of the Beatles and the Vietnam War and civil rights. And here's a grown
Yeah.
man looking like an 8-year-old. So, the art took a steep dive,
Right.
but I always felt that the art stands alone. Am a professional critic, or have been. And, when I sit there watching a movie, I'm talking about what's on the screen as much as
Right.
possible.
Right.
I know that my experience of the movie is informed by the politics of the day, the shape of showbiz, what I had for dinner,
Sure.
whether I had an argument with somebody that on my way into the theater, all those things. But you try and filter that out. And in the case of a subject that I'm writing at length about, 200,000 words, I've reached a point where I say, I'm just going to lay out the facts. This is
Yeah.
the man. This is
Yeah.
the art. So Clint
Right.
Eastwood, I can say, this guy has made 10 movies that people are always going to watch, and 2 or 3 of them define their genre. And he also did these things. And I was really careful not to cast aspersions at
Right.
Clint, because if grown-ups are reading this book and they read that this behavior happened, they can decide for themselves.
Beautiful.
So I'm not interested in, I tell people all the time, if all
That's
that,
very libertarian of you.
you if all the guy did was, have sex and yell at people, I wouldn't
Yeah.
have chosen him to write a book.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You
Sure.
know, he's an
He's
artist.
got depth. He's got depth. He's
Yeah.
got a lot of dimensions. Right.
And there's more things to say about him, his politics, his
Sure. Sure.
unique position in Hollywood. Clint Eastwood lives in Carmel, California, not in Los Angeles. That's
Yeah.
for a superstar, that's a really interesting choice.
Sure.
And it just makes you see him in a certain light. I'm currently working on a book about David Lynch, and
Cool.
I,
Really? How'd you decide that? That's
oh,
fun.
I mean, that's
I love
that's
his stuff.
that's another lucky stroke.
Really?
My, the way nonfiction works is, and perhaps fiction too, but I can't say. Um, your contract says your publisher has the right of first refusal on your next project.
Mhm.
And my agent and I will kick around ideas for the next book. Some of them I've got sitting in a folder, I've brought them up again and again. Paul Newman was an example, Clint Eastwood was an example. Um, and my agent would be like, nah. And then, like, 2, 3 books later, 8 years later, he's like, I think the time is right for this. And the publisher said, let's do your next book. In fact, let's just make the deal and we'll agree on a subject. So
Nice.
the contract
That's
was
appealing.
Hollywood book TBD.
That means they
And
trust you,
yeah,
not
yeah.
the
and I gave them something clean and salable. And they're in business. They
Yeah.
may talk about literature, but they're in business. And
Sure,
and
sure,
I
sure.
always joke that I get along with my publisher because they're only interested in art and I'm only interested in money. So we never we
Beautiful.
never disagree. Um, but they rejected 3 ideas that I had proposed. And I had written proposals. I had done the research. 2 biographies and a kind of a book on a theme. And we were in conversation on the phone the morning that David Lynch's death was announced, January 16th of this year. And he's hemming and hawing, like, the book that I was proposing. He's like, I just don't like this guy. I think that's it. And I was like, this guy's movies have grossed in the billions. You wouldn't buy the book anyhow. You'd get a free copy. But
Right.
clearly he sells tickets. But instead, I said, "What about David Lynch?" And he says, "Oh, tell me more." And off the top of my head, Lynch, I was in high school in New York and I saw Eraserhead when it was playing at midnight at the Waverly on Lower Sixth Avenue across from the basketball courts. It's no longer a theater. Um, but like that's where the cult of David Lynch began, that and the New Art in Los Angeles. And I've followed his career like in real time up to his
Yeah.
death. And as I was pitching him off the top of my head, I was again, it's 2025, so I have the internet, and I went to the Motion Picture Academy Library and Amazon, and I saw that there was no proper biography of David Lynch. There's interview-length books with him, but no biographer who's
Yeah.
approaching him from the third person and laying out and verifying and
Sure.
interviewing and doing the archive. And he said, "Huh, this is a good idea." And, we agree to keep talking. My agent calls like 2 hours later, "Oh, Peter's very excited about David Lynch." And I said, "Well, I'm not writing another proposal because in the last 8 months, I've written 3 proposals, got
How long do they
7."
take you to write usually?
Depending on how much I know about the subject to begin with, and then you wanna do research because you find more things and,
Sure.
so it can take a month to 2 to 3 months to truly write, because 'cause we're
Wow.
talking about a 30-page document in many cases.
Wow. God, it's not like a cover letter. It's
Yeah,
legit.
but this time I said, "I'm not writing another proposal," and my agent said, "Well, just write me a memo, a cover letter," and I wrote
Right.
2 or 3 paragraphs, and the next day we agreed, and
Amazing.
we had
So
to do that.
cool. And how long do you expect for this to take?
Um, I've been working since I wanna say since January, but I published a big book in the summer, and it took me away from Lynch for a couple of months.
And
Um,
congratulations on that.
Thank you. Yeah, that book, some of them are lucky, Got they asked Napoleon, "What type of generals do you like?" And he said, "Lucky ones."
Yeah.
You know? That's the type
Yeah.
of books I like to write, lucky ones. And, so I've been working about, I'll call it 7 months, and there's probably 3 to 5 more months of just absorbing, and then
Mhm.
I'll start writing, and it'll probably take me I expect to be done January 1st, 2027, and maybe publish it at the end,
Gotcha.
so 13 months from now.
Okay.
One of the lucky things is I'm a fast writer. I was a newspaper man.
Uh-huh.
I would have some weeks 12 bylines in the newspaper, and people would say, "Do you ever get writer's block?" I was like, "No, I work at a daily newspaper. If you have writer's block, you're
You're fired.
unemployed." And so what that means is my stuff is clean on the first draft. It's always gonna be improved. It's always gonna be deepened and
Sure.
enriched. But push comes to shove, people have published my first drafts in a
Wow.
newspaper that has more readers than I've ever sold copies of a book, you know?
Incredible. You're the first writer that I've spoken to that has that style for as like a writing method. I'm like that too. I dish out like, I don't ever run out of, like, things to write, and I typically write pretty cleanly. I can always look back and catch, okay, a little bit here, a little bit there, but, like, generally speaking, my second draft is extraordinarily similar to my first draft and whatever I'm working on. And all my other friends tell me, "Oh, editing is the best part, and, in my first draft, I have to cut 30 pages." I'm like, "What are you talking about, dude? Like, how does that even happen?" And you're the first person I've spoken to that doesn't have that experience. It's very funny.
I feel like on the sentence level, I've got the game, but
Right.
I'll always welcome feedback on the
The
structure,
content. Oh,
repetition,
right,
um, you know, are we spending too much time on this?
right.
On my very first book, um, the Jerry Lewis, toward the end of the book, one of the notable things that was happening to Jerry at the time I was writing was that there was a lot of investigation into the finances of the Muscular Dystrophy Association. And the editor just gave me like a single note. He said, people holding this book are going to feel they're getting near the end. And now you're bringing up this dense stuff.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, yeah, it's like, introducing a new character in the last part of a movie.
I had that problem with the movie Oppenheimer. I felt overwhelmed by all the information in the first half, and then Robert Downey Jr.'s character became like a central character, and I'm like, I'm mentally exhausted from
Yeah.
trying to pay attention by now. I'm not ready to introduce a whole new character and storyline,
Yeah,
or
that's
even
an
the Big
excellent
Lebowski
example.
when they on a more comedic sense when in the Big Lebowski where the guy introduces the Knut's family, and you're like, you just threw out a name that no one ever heard of, like this
Yeah.
entire movie, and we were just watching for the last 2.5 hours. Like, what do you plan on doing with his name? But there's always ways to do it. It's very funny.
Yeah, and it's great advice. It's great
Yeah,
advice.
it is great advice.
As a film critic, I would be going into movies, particularly this time of year when the prestige releases are coming out, vying
Mhm.
for Oscars. It's like, this
Sure.
movie is 2 hours and 20 minutes. That's 40 minutes longer than Casablanca or Citizen Kane. What the fuck are you gonna say in those 40 minutes that you need? You know?
Yeah, yeah.
I interviewed David Lean for
Mhm.
American Film Magazine. It was a phone interview. There were a bunch of reporters, and someone asked him if he had seen Dances with Wolves. And he sighed and he said, I'd like to sit that young man down and show him how to cut 20 minutes out of that film. And he wasn't saying it's a bad movie. He was saying like
Sure.
it
Do you
needed
feel that way
to.
about, like, Tarantino movies or, like Scorsese movies like The Irishman or something like that?
I go
Do you think
back
they
and
need it all
forth.
the time? Like, I feel like, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I really enjoyed every minute of that. It felt really intentional, and, I can understand from a just entertainment level, like, you'd want it to kinda move along a little bit. I felt like The Irishman, for example, coulda cut probably 20, 30 minutes of that, or 15 minutes. I don't know if it was at 20 minutes, 30 minutes, but 15, 20 minutes, I think, like, it was long. And for
I
what?
I know, and it's a weird thing. Cinema's a weird thing. We decided a century ago, some businessmen in California decided that a movie should be about 120 minutes.
Yeah.
Why not 40 minutes? I've always wanted to do a film festival of movies under 90 minutes because comedies, westerns, crime movies, animated
Sure.
films, if they're 80 something minutes, I'll watch them.
Yeah.
Even if they have a lousy reputation, because
Yeah.
there's, the old showbiz adage, leave them wanting more. That said, if you're setting out to make an epic and you're a filmmaker in your 70s and you're wrestling with ideas that have governed your career for a half a century, I'm going to lean back and say,
Space.
okay, you have earned the right to be on stage longer than a younger filmmaker, maybe.
Sure.
And it's the scale of the subject as well. So Oppenheimer, I agree with you, but I also see the point that, like, this guy's story
Yeah.
spanned decades and worlds.
Yeah.
So I can go both ways. And
What do you think of the new the Netflix, or Netflix style, I guess HBO really started it, but the, like, limited series, so you have, like, 8 episodes of, like, an hour each, and, that's all there is to the story. I think that's been a really cool way to be able to tell great stories.
yeah, I watched this thing that I didn't much care for on Netflix recently, but I watched the whole thing
Fun.
because it was only 4 episodes. Death by Lightning, about the assassination of James Garfield.
Mm.
I like the
You didn't care for it?
actors. It was just really, it was phony. It was phony all the way through. And, it made me doubt the history
Right.
because, well, I'm such a stickler. I just happened to, in a little free library in my neighborhood, I found a copy of Tarantino's novel, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood,
Nice.
which is
Nice.
a different telling of the same story. Very different, as it turned out. But there are things that immediately trigger me as a researcher of mid-century popular culture. So someone is described as looking like that guy from room 222, and I'm like, "Zzz," and I immediately Google it on my phone. It takes 19 seconds. Room 222, the sitcom about a school, a high school, um, did not debut until after the events of this novel. Someone
Ah, man.
steps into a backyard and says there were a bunch
I
of
did.
beat up there were a bunch of beat up big wheels. And I'm like, I was a kid in 1969. I didn't see a big wheel. I Google big wheels came out the following year. It's just like if you're going to date stamp something,
Yeah,
I'm going
that's
to
cool.
check you.
That's fun though, and it's cool but it's cool when that's done well and accurately. You know,
Yeah.
like or intentionally not. Like again, you know, with the Big Lebowski, like the Coen brothers, every fun fact they drop in that movie is an incorrect fun fact. Like it's just
Yeah.
wrong. You know, and
But
like if you take it,
they
they say
relish
it's
that.
what?
They relish that. Like
Yeah, they love that. That's great. It's great. Um,
Fargo begins with the crawl that says, this is based on a true event. And Bill Macy during the filming said to them, so what's the real story? And what do you mean? Well, it says in the script this is based on a real event. They said, oh no, we just made that up.
yeah, there you go.
And
That's fun.
Tarantino, begins two movies, Once Upon a Time. And if, Inglorious Bastards, the screen says Once Upon a Time
Sure.
in World War II. And once you say Once Upon a Time, everything is allowed to be phony.
That's right.
But if you're going to date the thing and someone is comparing someone to a TV character who has never been seen, ah,
I
it
hear.
Marvelous Mrs. Maisel was sloppy about this all the time. And at the time that show was very popular, I was working on a book about the women pioneers of stand-up comedy.
That's
Phyllis
cool.
Diller, Joan Rivers, Moms Mabley, Minnie Pearl,
Cool.
Elaine May. And I was watching this show. I was like, that's not real. That's not real. That's not real. And I'm sitting there. I happen to be well informed, but I also have a computer in my pocket that
Yeah.
is connected to the world's information database. And all it would have taken, you just could use a different name or song or fact. And it just makes you suspicious of the whole enterprise. Anyway, that death by lightning turned out to be quite accurate.
Oh,
It just felt phony.
just felt phony.
Yeah. So that's not good. I'd rather it feel real and be inaccurate.
So funny, so crazy. I want to talk to you about your De Niro biography.
Sure.
So I actually wanted to ask, aside from your what the process of the De Niro book was, including how you got into it and what the research and stuff was like, because he's alive and it's cool to talk about a living subject. Um, I don't remember whether I read this in the Springsteen biography or another book, but allegedly the scene where De Niro's famous "Are You Talking to Me" scene was taken from a Springsteen concert that Springsteen was playing at Max's in New York, and Scorsese and De Niro were at the show, and they were calling Springsteen in for an encore. And he kept yelling, "Are you talking to me? Are you talking to me?" And then Scorsese and De Niro looked at each other and like, "We got to implement this somehow."
Yeah,
Do you know if that's a true story?
absolutely true.
Absolutely true.
Yeah, yeah. I think
Wow.
it was De Niro alone. I don't think like they shared the note while they were in the club, but Springsteen and De Niro kind of hovered around each other in that mid '70s period. Clarence Clemens,
Sure.
Springsteen's right
Saxophone
hand,
player. Yeah.
um, appears in New York, New York with De Niro. De
Oh,
Niro is playing the saxophone and Clarence is playing a trumpeter. So
wow.
the worlds did hover around, and the "Are You Talking to Me" sequence in Taxi Driver was complete improv. It was one of the final days that they had access to the set because the building they were shooting his apartment was going to be demolished or completely gutted, and they had to leave. And so De Niro said, "I have an idea for something," and that's the scene that was his idea.
It's so
But
great.
it was a bit of business he took from Springsteen. Absolutely.
So cool. So cool. I love that kind of stuff. I love those little, especially because what's fun is about these individuals and like it also shows how much work could go into all this researching. Everyone has so many different passions in their lives, you know, and so like they have so many different parts to them, and like everyone has strands of their lives at pulling in different directions, and and everything kind of all comes together that's centered around that individual, and so like the De Niro has like the love for music, or then the acting, and then the New York, like the dirty New York grimy scene and the mafia stuff, and so like you don't get him unless you get all that, but all that exists on their own too. And like you almost have to like cover that and understand that in order to understand him.
Yeah. You know, I always compare writing a biography to a clothesline. Okay, you have this cord that
Mm.
goes from one post or one wall to another, and it's the chronology. This happened, this happened, this happened, this happened, this happened. Every human life has that. What's interesting is what's hanging off the clothesline. So in the case of De Niro, you have, he was like the last of the great generation of method actors. His parents were artists in lower New York and helped move artists. His mother literally was the landlord that introduced artists into Tribeca and Soho. And then
Cool.
De Niro winds up creating a real estate empire in Tribeca.
Didn't
And
he? Was he associated with what's the famous Nobu? Was De
yeah,
Niro?
he,
That was
he,
it too,
um,
right? Sure,
he
Michael
and
was talking about
his
that.
restaurant, yeah, he owned the building the on Greenwich Street, the Tribeca Film Center. Miramax was the main tenant. He needed a restaurant in the ground floor. He went into business with a guy named Drew Nearpont, who just released a memoir, and they together hired Nobu. I'm never going to say his last name properly, but that's
Yes, 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 I know. Yes, sure.
he was working at a tiny sushi bar in Beverly Hills, and
Right.
they hired him to do that. And the global Nobu empire, which includes hotels now, is partly owned by Robert De Niro to this day.
Incredible. Incredible. Crazy. So he had a very so tell me how you got started and what and then I guess you mentioned that Jerry was alive obviously while you were writing about him. What was it like working with De Niro, especially because his his persona, changes so much, after the early 2000s, and like the types of
Yeah.
roles and does that indicate like a shift in interest in his life or a change of like, what's going on, with him or was this always another side of him you wanted to explore, but he was typecast for a while because, of all his previous success?
He's a difficult guy to write about because he really is very defensive and closed-mouthed.
He
One of
is.
the very first interviews published with him in the New York Post in like 1972 or so said, "It's impossible to talk with this guy. Here's an exact trans.
Transcript.
Thank you. For some
You're
reason, the sentence a little
welcome.
uh,
She covered.
didn't present itself. Here's a transcript of a conversation with him, and I ask a question, and it's filled with and ellipses and half sentences, and then it ends. Is that okay? Is that an answer? So, like from the very beginning, he's been that guy. But then you see him in movies, and he's bringing forth so much energy, particularly in the first 25 years of his acting career.
Hmm.
I was able to write a book about him because, like Jerry Lewis, he donated all his papers, in this case to the University of Texas at Austin, where they have a major research center that specializes in acquiring these type of collections. So I had the handwritten notes that he had for Taxi Driver and Godfather 2 and all these amazing Mean Streets and like him writing in the script uh, a note in the script of Taxi Driver that says lonely, 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 remember the girl you saw on 14th Street. I don't know what that story is, but it tells me something about how he comes up with his process. So based on that archive, which went from like the early 60s to the mid 2000 aughts, I was able to build the spine of a biography. And my suspicion about what happened to him after I always the thing that stuck a fork in him as like a master actor was Meet the Parents. I find that movie delightful. But Meet the Parents and Analyze This were comedies. They were very easy for him to prepare for compared to roles in even, just a couple of years before. He had been simultaneously on screen in Cape Fear and Heat.
That was a
You know,
crazy movie. That was a crazy
Casino.
movie.
These are big roles and they're hard. They're making him dig into himself. And he's, at this point in his 50s, he's got multiple relationships of uh, partners and ex-partners and children to raise. He's investing a lot of time and money in real estate, and he's just beginning to see a different kind of financial outcome from his movies. Because as great as we may esteem movies like Mean Streets and Raging Bull and Cape Fear, they didn't make him super money, but he produced Meet the Parents, and that was a nine-figure hit.
Nice.
And then he just started saying, there's a joke near the end of that book. The comedian, is it Joel McHale? He says, a lot of people do an imitation of De Niro. I do an imitation of De Niro's agent. Ring, ring. Yes, he'll do it. I don't know if I put this in the book, but I know I said it a lot at around the
So
time that the
funny.
book came out, which was 2014, that somewhere on Earth, Robert De Niro is asleep in a Four Seasons
Yeah.
hotel. And if you tapped him on the shoulder and said, Bobby, where are you and what movie are you making? I'm not sure he could answer. There
Yeah.
were years where he made 5 movies in the 2010s, and you would not want to watch any of them. But then he made Silver Linings Playbook. It was nominated for an Oscar for the first time since, I believe, Cape Fear, maybe
He didn't act
Casino.
in that, did he? He acted in Silver Linings Playbook?
Yeah, he was played the Bradley Cooper's father.
Oh, right. Right, right, right.
And
Yes.
and that seemed to ground him again. And he started to choose different types of roles. And he's still making the bad grandpas and these terrible movies, but I think that the grab all the protein I can and I'll worry about digesting it later phase of his career is over. And working with Scorsese again, I think is very grounding for him. He trusts that process, but boy, there was a time when the idea that there was a new Bobby De Niro movie would like, I literally took a train from Philadelphia, where I was in college, to New York to see the opening weekend of Raging Bull. And
Wow.
by the 2010s, it was like, I'm not even going to go to my living room to watch this shit that he's making.
Yeah, yeah. I'm also curious, and actually, I'm not sure how much you know about this particular aspect of the industry, but I read a great book. Actually, I take it back. I read a book that had a lot of great information that I didn't love the way it was written, but called The Easy Rider, Raging Bull. And one of the fascinating things that he discusses is like the power dynamic shift within Hollywood as time goes on. That, in the 50s, I believe, 40s and 50s, it was heavily producer based. And then it became a little bit more of a director's world in the 60s and 70s, or late 60s, early 70s. And then it kind of became an actor's world, right? Actors started taking control, and now it's pretty much a studio world, or a streaming services world, I suppose.
Yeah.
Whoever has the biggest pocketbooks. But I'm wondering if there's an association between, like if like De Niro did a great job in the director's era. Like that was where he thrived, was with great directors. And I'm curious that as the directors kind of lost, like De Niro started, like the actors rather, not just De Niro himself, but actors in general started getting a bigger say as to what, creative say what was going on. I wonder if the shift from, who's the creative force behind the movie had an impact on the type of movies they were as well.
I think it did to some extent. De Niro was, by the time that shift happened, he was considered, a major prestige star, not major box office, like Charles Bronson and Clint Eastwood and Burt
Right,
Reynolds. All their movies were much more popular.
right.
Um, but people, it's the old thing. Clint Eastwood got funded by Warner Brothers to make Bird, a 2 hour and 45-minute biopic about Charlie Parker, starring Forrest Whitaker, who had never had a lead role before in anything. And he said to Warner Brothers, look, I'm going to do my best to do it under budget, and you may not make a fortune off this, but you will be proud to have made it. And I think that's how studios felt about De Niro. And he
Yeah.
didn't really take the reins of his own career in the sense of like developing scripts and producing material
He's a
from
band. He's a
scratch.
band.
Yeah, he did that starting in the 90s
Right.
when he, you know,
Well, that's Netflix's new model for getting talent now. I mean, they basically like, that's what they do with Ryan Reynolds and Chris Hemsworth and Adam Sandler. Is they say do anything you ever wanted. It could be the biggest flop in the planet. It could be trash. I want the name Adam Sandler associated with Netflix.
Yeah.
Period. You know.
And these films make money because this is the same as in publishing. I write these book proposals and I think of them as a prospectus. I'm saying if you invest X number of dollars in me to do this, you can earn X plus Y out the back end. And we don't know, the civilian population doesn't know what an Adam Sandler movie grosses for Netflix globally, but Netflix does. So if
Sure.
they're saying yes, it's because their actuarial models prove that
Yeah.
we
Yeah.
will profit from this.
There's an awesome book that I read by a guy Ben Fritz who actually I before I got this podcast started, I wanted to start another one, and he was one of the first people I reached out to, and he actually got back to me, which is great. But I was very happy about. But one of the things he talked about was the reason he noticed the reason why studios stopped making dramas and stop making, like you can't make a Dead Poet Society today that's going to be put out in theaters really, but it'll go out in streaming services. And one of the arguments he makes is that the global box office has gone so huge, but it needs information that can be easily converted from America to China to Europe to wherever. And what better than Transformers or another Avengers movie, And but the streaming services that count on subscribers, they want to get as many different types of people constantly subscribing and keeping up with what they're putting out. They're incentivized to make these dramas or these, more, character-driven movies or, plot-driven films that don't need to translate over to foreign markets.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And that was especially true in the 80s, when action movies and action stars like absolutely Stallone and Schwarzenegger and, you know, absolutely dominated. One of the interesting things I learned working on Clint Eastwood, he made in 1995 The Bridges of Madison County, um, a romance based on a trillion selling shitty novel. And it's basically a two actor movie with Clint and Meryl Streep. They have a brief affair and they part. And it was a heroic adaptation of crappy but popular material. It's a really good movie, and Clint holds his own with the greatest screen actor of our generation, of
Mm,
several generations.
sure, sure.
Um, but it tripled its budget in ticket sales in China,
There you go.
because in China, the story of a forbidden love told in a certain melodramatic, weepy way is absolute platinum. But nobody knew that at Warner Brothers. So like they were thinking, oh, maybe we'll get some Oscar nominations, and the people who read this book, and it did okay in the States, and it was very well received by critics, but it absolutely went gangbusters in China, and they could never reproduce the formula. Like they had no idea why, and they couldn't hit that mark again. And Clint's like, I'm not even going to take a second bite of that apple. He moved on to other things, but the studio kept trying to do it. And you
Yeah.
see that in Warner Brothers production schedules of the following years. They're trying to make, they can't make a sequel, but they're trying to make Allah. You
Is it
know?
terrible that it makes me a little happy that they don't figure out that formula is? Because if they did, they would just, juice that for all that it's worth. They'd milk every penny that they could out of that until everyone was sick of that genre for the rest of time. So, like, I'm okay with them not figuring that out as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah,
You
no,
know?
and I agree. But this has always been the way. Everyone in Hollywood wants to be the second person to do
That's
something
right. That's right.
because the first guy took a risk.
That's
And
right.
he may
That's
not
right.
have his job. But if you
I
say, hey, Bridges of Madison County, wow, think of the ticket sales in China, someone will say, okay, yeah, go ahead. And you
I
can
have
always
I
blame
teach,
it on,
my high school. I'm just teaching my high school English class now about how revolutionary Pixar was and the first Toy Story movie was. And we're going through a couple of different books and a couple of different. There's a great book by a guy Lawrence Levy who I really hope to interview. I've been in touch with him, but he was the CFO when the company went public. And then Ed Catmull, his famous book Creativity Inc., but was talking about all these different stories for leadership and creativity and stuff. And one thing I was trying to get them to realize is like no one wants to be the first to invest in a risk. Like, but once that and I was like, and there's always a direct, almost always a direct correlation between, you know, the first movie being really creative, and then the next movie making more money and being significantly less creative. You know, and
Yeah.
there's always that break off, and you know, two, three. I asked, I did an interview with producer of Taken, the Taken trilogy, and he was like, and I was like, did you want to make the second and third movies? Like after the first one is so great, did you feel like you'd be cheapening it? And he was like, you know, at a certain point, like there's no saying no to the studios. The money's pouring in, like you know, and they just say like, okay, I'm not gonna make a bad script, but like I'll make a pretty good script. You know, you're like, okay, fine, like just to do it. You know,
Yeah, and there's something to it. We want to see the further adventures of, again, leave them wanting more.
sure,
Um, Nobody left The Irishman, for example. I admire the movie, but I didn't love it. And when it was over, I was like, thank you. Not like, oh, I can't wait. Let's have
yeah,
more of that.
yeah, yeah,
And the great example, the counter example, but also the true example is Godfather 2, where the
sure,
studio said, we have the rights and we're going to make a sequel. And you, Francis Coppola, and you, Mario Puzo, are our first choice to write and direct this material. But if you don't, we're going to do it anyhow.
yeah.
And they wound up making, in many people's,
Great. Potentially,
a
potentially
better
better.
movie that some
Yeah.
people,
What do you think?
go back and forth. But that's extremely rare. And, you know, there is no pre-sale for the first, but there's a pre-sale for the second.
What do
Uh,
you? Which one did you like more? Godfather one or two?
to me, they're one movie.
Well, in the
They're
book,
made,
it's one movie. I mean, one
they're
book.
made so close together.
Yeah.
Look at the Avatar films, decades passing between them.
Hmm.
Um, the only thing that feels, in my mind, in cinema history that is similar to the unity of Godfathers 1 and 2, and I'll argue for a bit for Godfather 3, but I don't expect to succeed. Um,
It's
it's
very
the
generous.
it's the Before trilogy, Rick Linklater's films with Ethan Hawke and Julie Delpy, which are organically three films that feel like one story. So you watch the three of them together, and the Jesse and Clarice story absolutely plays as
Right.
one movie.
Right. Okay, that's a great way to look at them. I think I agree because aesthetically, like the whole like the movies do like they do flow one into the other. Like you do feel like you could be watching again like two episodes of Sopranos or like a Netflix or like a limited series where you're just watching one episode and you're watching the next one and they kind of like flow into the next.
And while we're talking about the Godfather 1 and 2, think of what Robert De Niro had to do to play Vito Corleone as a young man. Okay? 15 months prior,
Marlon
the
Brando.
greatest actor in Hollywood won an Oscar for creating this character. And he had to backwards engineer what would that guy have been like as a young man in Sicilian, which he did not speak,
Incredible.
and in a period film. And this was at a time when there was no VCRs. So De Niro went to a room in an editing facility in New York and had just Brando's scenes from Godfather 1 shown to him again and again. And he took, I literally held the papers in my hand. He took generations of notes. He had at least a half a dozen screenings, and there were
Incredible.
little gestures. And then in the script, he would say, use this gesture. Like, something that Vito Corleone does that he's going to do, but he
Incredible.
deployed it in a certain way. So, like, just logistically, one of the genius acting jobs ever undertaken.
Yeah. Yeah. What'd you think of Awakenings with Robin Williams? Awakening.
You know, that to me is a very Hollywood movie. I think De Niro was nominated for an Oscar for doing a lot of things, but
It's the kind of movie I feel like should have worked but fell short somehow.
you know, it it's a Penny Marshall film. I'm not sure she was the right director for that material, even though
Hmm.
many of her movies are about sort of ugly ducklings,
Hmm.
people who shouldn't be good at something and are, so a league of their own.
Yeah.
Um, Big, another transformations movie. Um, and I think her strong suit is comedy. Um, so when I saw Awakenings, I saw it when it first came out because it was at a time when I was still so enamored of De Niro, I would see anything right away. I was probably professionally seeing it at that time as well, but I didn't care for it when I first saw it. And this is one of the joys of having been a critic and then now being a biographer. I frequently go back and revisit a movie that I initially
Sure.
reviewed, like in an overnight in a newspaper journalist, like Tuesday night screening, Wednesday morning deadline.
Hmm.
Um, and then I see the movie again to write the biography, and then let me go look at my review, and I was like, oh, I kind of nailed it. Like,
Oh, really?
I,
You felt the same both ways, both
eh,
times.
often,
That's awesome.
often,
That's really
and
cool. That's really
I'll
interesting.
literally steal my own sentences. I was like, I'm not going to write a funnier line than that, you know. So,
Yeah.
and I don't have to footnote it because it's me.
Yeah, definitely. I wanna I want to wrap up for now, although the truth is I could keep on going for a long time like this. I love these kind of conversations. I want to ask you about your book of poetry about what was the title? I'm
It's
sorry.
it's it's called A Year in the Life of Death.
Yes, yes. Can you tell me about that and what that seems like such a left turn, relative to
Yeah,
everything else that you've written about. What is that about and how'd you get into it?
I've always been a poet in my head. My sentences, I write with the same craft I like to think as I would pay attention to the lines of a poem. In 2015 or 16, after a long hiatus, I started writing poetry again. I took some workshops, something opened up in me. I had a conversation with a friend at a reading series where people wrote, essays and shared. And she wrote about, I'm a lifelong reader of newspapers and obituaries. And she read about someone whose death had recently been in the New York Times. And I had read that same obituary with great
Wow.
interest. And we got to talking about this person. And I said, oh, I bet there's an inspiration. I could write a poem about her. And I bet there's an inspiration every day in the obit pages of the New York Times for a poem. And I'm going to try and do that.
That's beautiful. It's
Well,
so cool.
it was a lunatic idea because that's 365 days.
Yeah.
And it turns out there's not an inspiration every day. There are days when there's just like, oh, another Polish general and Russian ballerina and shortstop have died, and I got nothing to say about any of these people. But it was the year 2016, and that was the year we lost David Bowie, Prince, Merle Haggard, George Michael, Leonard Cohen, Nancy
Oh my
Reagan,
gosh.
John Glenn, Fidel Castro, Muhammad Ali, It was just like the New York Times even did an article saying it's not just you. More famous people have died this year than most years.
Hmm.
So I collected 100 of them. I wrote about 175, and the
Wow.
100 got crafted into a book based on New York Times obits, and they wind up being odes. In some cases, they're jokes because, as I always say, if you're not having a laugh about death, you're
Yeah.
really not understanding the whole story. I didn't know it at the time. There's a two line poem by Robert Frost. And it goes, forgive, O Lord, my little jokes on thee, and I'll forgive thy great big one on me. You know, and
Excellent.
and
Excellent.
that's the spirit. Like there were people I knew in the New York Times obits that year. There were people who reminded me of my parents whom I'd lost. There were
Sure.
people, my partner, the love of my life, someone she felt very close to, an artist that, so some of the poems are very personal. Some of them are like, how do you write a poem about Muhammad Ali? uh, Fidel Castro, like they're too
Yeah.
big. And then
Yeah.
you discover other people that you never heard of, like the guy who chose the @ sign for email when the internet was first being
Oh,
developed.
cool.
It was like
Cool.
nobody used that button, and now we use it every day,
Yeah.
you
Incredible.
know? So
Incredible.
things like that. So it wound up being this very happy. It was published by a local Portland poetry
Wow.
press.
I gotta check that out. It's
And
funny because I was going through just for your work just to like to just do some homework and I came across it. I'm like, That looks so cool. It looks so fascinating. Are you a fan of that, like, it's typically the folk genre, but I guess sometimes a little country, sometimes western too, about like Bob Dylan's like Lonesome Death of Hattie Carroll, or those type of songs where you just, again, he picked up an obituary, he went to the New York Library, read the story and was like, got to tell the story,
Yeah,
Dooley.
absolutely. It combines several interests of mine. It's like a whole life briefly told on a deadline.
Yeah.
That's my journalism and biographer selves. The Venn diagram is almost like a complete circle, but also it's like, who knew? Who
Yeah.
knew?
Yeah.
One of the people I wrote about is we all know her and we don't know her. She is the nurse who's being kissed in Times Square in the very famous photo
Yeah.
from the end of World War II.
That's
And what was interesting to me is I'm looking at this through the lens of the, you know, first quarter of the 21st century. And it's like, wait, some sailor just went up to a woman, grabbed her, and kissed her. And if you look at her, her arms are limp. And this is not a romantic picture. This is an assault.
right.
Like if this happened to my partner or my daughter or my
You killed
sister,
the guy.
I'd be looking for the guy, you know.
Jerry,
But
you put Jerry on
you know,
here.
and it's just really interesting how like a conversation can shift in history. I get this woman was known to everyone and unknown. Like
Yeah.
even her grandkids didn't know it was her.
Wow. Wow. Crazy. Yeah. Yeah. It's an amazing genre. It's really, really cool. And it's really cool to compress. I don't, it's cool to compress a life. It's always curious. It's always fun to think about like what that person would think about what their life compressed would be like, like yeah. It's curious. I wonder how many people have an input on what the obituary says about them.
It's I still read the obituaries every day, and I love when I'm reading I read the New York Times obituaries and the Guardian, those the British newspaper.
Sure.
For me, they're kind of like the gold standard of daily newspaper death notices. And every occasionally, like it's a very notable person, and they are in old age, like they are in
Right.
their 80s or 90s when they pass, and you will see a sentence. So and so said in an interview granted for the composition of this obituary. I'm like,
Beautiful.
oh,
Cool.
that takes. I don't know if I could ring the doorbell and say, "Hey, you're going to die. Can we get you?" You know?
You think that it doesn't go the other way? Like if someone were to be like, you're getting sick and you're getting older, and you'll be like, hey, like, I want, for the record, I want to say
Yeah.
this, I want to say that. I imagine that'd be more likely the case.
I know, but it's still like I
Yeah.
personally would be uncomfortable making that call. When I was writing about Paul Newman, the book was due at the publisher first Monday in November of 2008. Newman died at the end of September, but his death had been, the coming of his death had been expected. There were
Hmm.
pictures of him coming in and out of Sloan Kettering, being treated for cancer, gaunt and frail, and
Right.
he'd shrunk away from public life. So people knew. So as a result, when he died, there were obituaries for him in every city, town, country where he had made a movie, raced a car, built a camp for sick kids, taken a fishing vacation with his buddies. So
Sure.
in that weekend of his death, those obituaries provided me with huge new stories and information and people I could
Wow.
reach out to, and
Right.
probably added 10,000 words to the book,
Wow.
and gave me an ending.
There you
But
go.
the obituary writers did their homework in advance, knowing I wrote obituaries at the Oregonian for people. I'd have a light week and I'd say, I'm going to prepare some obituaries. And I wrote in advance about Elizabeth Taylor, Marlon Brando, Bob Hope, a number of people. I said, these are
Cool.
great figures. And why should we do this on a deadline?
Yeah. Take our
I'm going to
time.
do it now. And we just fill in the details of when they died and where and of what and on the day. And
Wow.
I left the paper in 2013, and some of those obituaries got published a year or three later
Yeah.
because they were still on the server.
Sure. 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 Yeah. So cool. So interesting. Such an interesting pastime. It's really fun. So you've been more into poetry now.
I still write poems. I still participate in, you know, the, I'm, as I say, involved in the Portland writing community.
Yeah.
And I don't write fiction. I've tried. I just don't have that muscle.
Hmm.
Um, but I still get inspired to write poems, and I've still written, even though the Obit Poems Project that book was published in 2021. There are occasions where I've written other pieces in the same form. They all have the same form. You're reading the poem, and at the end comes the New York Times headline. So there's this little sort of jack in the box pop out. You're reading, who is this? Who? Oh, it's David Bowie. And then you go back and reread it and you say, oh, of course it's David Bowie.
Yeah.
Um, and so I've written a couple of those.
That's fun though. That's a cool creative assignment.
And I've written some other sequences, and I've written some longer family-based poems. Um, I have a trilogy of pieces, one about the family song, like my extended Italian American New York family
Cool.
determined a family song, and then one about my mom's apartment in Brooklyn, which was the family seat. And
Sure.
now I'm working on one called Family Bed. My parents, suburban, ordinary household, but they had a very open door policy. And I would come home and my sister's friends would be napping in my parents' bed. And I'm like, what
So
is going? My
funny.
parents weren't in the bed. Um, but like there was a TV in that room and it was sort of like the center of
Yeah,
the
yeah,
house.
yeah,
It's
yeah,
really
sure,
quiet.
sure.
So
Growing up, my neighborhood was like that too. Growing up, most houses would have maybe one TV, and it's usually in the parents' room. And we went to watch, like America's Funniest Home Videos. You all pile into the parents' room, or you connect your game console to it, and
exactly.
that's where
Yeah.
you'd hang out. Totally.
So it's like the family bed. That feels like a trilogy, but they're all long poems and written in different styles. But my brain still works in sort of like a systematic way.
Sure.
I
I
have
had a fun I had a group with when I graduated college. I'm curious. I'm super curious if it's something that you would if you would try it, and what you would think of it. But it's 10-minute prompts. So you set a timer. You have a prompt. You set a timer for 10 minutes and just pound out what you can. Just get 10 minutes train of thought. Stream of consciousness. As as the lights go out, go. What's your association with it? Or with my high school students, I'll play scores for movies that they don't know. And then I'll say, tell me, write a story as the music's playing
Oh,
of
I
the
love
images that's conjured in your head. And what's cool is it's incredible how unique it is, but how there's certain like musical tones or themes that create a universal image in everyone's head. There's like I started a John Williams score. Everyone starts off once upon a time, in a
it.
in a forest somewhere. A hero is like racing towards, and like everyone had variations of that, but like they were all able to intone subconsciously or creatively from the music, the same image. I thought it was so cool. But the 10-minute prompts had led to some of my most creative writings because you felt pressure to get something done, and that stream of consciousness is where a lot of the creativity comes from. You know,
And that's how I got back into writing poetry. My partner is a novelist and creative writer, and she started taking workshops with the genius writer Lydia Yuknovich, whose memoir, Chronology of Water, has just been made into a film by Kirsten Stewart that's being
cool,
released in the coming months. And I attended a couple of Lydia's weekend-long workshops and did prompt writing for the
so much
first
fun.
time since like maybe high school. Because in the MFA workshops I took in Irvine in the 80s, we didn't have anything like that. And
Yeah,
that got me back into writing poetry. And I specifically thank Lydia in that poetry book
I'm so happy.
because
That's
it
awesome.
wouldn't have happened
So,
without her unlocking that vault that had been
yeah,
shut for decades while I was making money with my pen.
that's right. That's right. That's right. Bring the artistry back into it a little bit.
Yeah,
Well, Sean, I really appreciate the time. This was really such a fun. This is such a fun conversation,
I
and
agree.
filled with just a lot of great tidbits and great stories. So I hope maybe we'll do this again, part two. You got a lot more that you could talk
Yeah,
about. We
yeah.
could talk
Reach out
about.
anytime. Lynch should be out in about 2 years' time, and I'll be pounding the drum for that. And all of my books are referenced on ShawnLevy.com, and you can find them at
I'll
Amazon and
post
your
I'll recap here.
bookshop.org, your local indie,
Beautiful, beautiful, love it. I'm
local
gonna
indie bookstores.
post your profile and all the and the links to your stuff on the episode page. All right.
I'm not on Twitter any longer. I'm on Blue Sky, Instagram, and Threads.
Beautiful.
So
Okay.
those socials,
Okay.
mainly talking about soccer, but
Really?
that's another conversation.
That is. I almost went to a Seattle soccer game. They won the championship the year that I was living there in 2019, 2020.
Yeah. Well, as an OG of the Timbers Army in Portland, I can only say fuck Seattle.
Beautiful. Well, in those words,
That is a true rivalry.
there you go. We'll call it there. Sean, thank you so much. Have a great day,
Well,
man. Take
thanks
care.
so much for the invitation.
Of course. Bye bye.